Then we move on to the back side of the first page. And for that, we now need to prepare our cylinder head by installing the valves and the valve springs into the cylinder head. So I'm going to need my cylinder head. I'm going to need a blue rag that I'm going to want to wad up and eventually stuff underneath the combustion chamber. And I'm going to need my valves, intake and exhaust. I'm going to need some red stuff for lubrication. And I may need either this blue valve spring installation tool or a 19mm deep wall 3/8 drive socket to help me install the keepers, because sometimes they can be little buggers. Okay? The one with the bracket here is your intake. Make sure this goes down before the spring. I'm going to go ahead and pull these apart, lubricate things here, get them set up to go. Okay. When we lubricate the valves, we just need a little bit of red stuff on the stem part where it's going to go up into the guide. So that's the intake. That's the exhaust. So I flip it over. The exhaust is always the smaller one. Okay. Usually it's pretty easy to tell if we haven't cleaned the engine, because there'll be some black carbon buildup or staining around the exhaust. Make sure that lines up, and it should just slip right in. Similarly with the intake. Slip right in. Then I'm going to take my paper towel, I'm going to wad it up. And that's to prevent my valves from dropping while I install the springs. So clip for the intake valve spring, and then the intake keeper. I usually try to do it with my fingers first, but if I can't, I can use this to help me push down on that spring keeper to get it installed. Okay, so that intake went on really nice. Let's see if the exhaust will do the same. Push down, over, and now my valves are installed. Okay, let's see from the bottom side here. You'll notice that I have my dowel pins, and then as explained before when we took them apart, we're trying to pinch pennies and see how many torque cycles we can get out of these cylinder head gaskets, so hopefully it's still there and in place and disturb the least amount possible. So we'll clear the work area, bring my engine back over, and make sure we have a clean, clear deck as far as grease and other contaminants. We'll line up our dowel pins and our push rod bores. We'll get it installed. Set that down. Should slide down and sit right into place fairly easily for you. And then we've got to drop in our 4 cylinder head bolts. These are going to be 12 millimeters. I'm going to just spin them down by hand. Okay, I got those tightened down, hand tight as far as I can go. The torque spec on these bolts is going to be 200 inch-pounds. And when we do this, we want to tighten them in 50 inch-pound increments. So that means I'm going to do 50 inch-pounds in a crisscross pattern. Then I'm going to do 100 inch-pounds in a crisscross pattern. Then 150, then 200. So first here we got to get my wrench set. Looks like the lowest my wrench goes is 60 inch-pounds. So we're going to do 60, 100, 150, then 200 in a crisscross pattern. I'll start with this one here. I'm going to go across. This may be where you need a partner to help hold your engine as these torque values start to get higher. So there's 60. We'll do 100. Okay, now 150. Now 200. So the head's torqued. Time for another checkpoint. And now it's time to install the push rods and rocker arm assembly. So I've got my push rods over here on the cardboard. Earlier when we took them out, we had to identify the top versus the bottom and which one's the intake versus the exhaust. Again, because it does matter when you're rebuilding an engine with used components that you put things back exactly where they belong, unless you're replacing them with new. So I'll start with my intake here. I'm going to put a little bit of red stuff on the bottom before I drop it in. This side with the spacer and the long studs is my intake, and I need to make sure that when I go put it in, it drops down into the little cup of the tappet. Okay, so set that one in. Grab my exhaust next. Put a little bit of red stuff on the bottom. Make sure that it goes down and sits into the tappet like so. Okay. Up next is my rocker arm assembly. Pointed this out when we took it apart, but just as a reminder, all four of these bolts that hold it on are different. This one right here needs to be the longest of your four, and then the two on the sides have to be the smaller diameter bolt flanges. Okay, if you use the wrong bolt here, the flange is going to be too big and it's going to stick off to the side, and it's going to make it hard for you to properly install your valve cover. Before I set this down, I want lubrication on the tops of the push rods and on the valve stem tips. So I'm going to use a little bit of red stuff for there. So I'll just put a little bit of red stuff there and there, and some on top of my valve stem tips. And then I'm going to very carefully go ahead and set down my rocker arm assembly, making sure that the push rods go into both the cups in the rocker arm assembly. And then I'm going to take my 8mm and spin the bolts down. I'm going to reposition this slightly. When you have multiple bolts holding the same thing down, you want to make sure that you leave them loose till they're all in and started. Don't put one in and tighten it all the way up, because you might find that your second one goes in okay, your third one may go in okay, but that last one might be difficult. These bolts don't really have a ton of thread engagement and are notorious for stripping out holes if we over torque them. The torque on these is very low at 60 inch-pounds. So we'll set this to 60 inch-pounds. I like to do the top center one here first. Okay, and the bottom middle one, then the outers. At this point, we now need to get a feeler gauge blade, 9mm combination wrench, and a small screwdriver so that we can check and set our valve lash. What we need to do is set our engine to top dead center of the compression stroke to set our valve clearance or lash. You can see this one here Doesn't have really any play to them. So, you know, things have changed since we last took it apart. So even if our lash was good before, it may not be now. What I want to do is rotate my crankshaft until my piston is at top dead center. An indication that I'm at top dead center, other than looking through the spark plug hole, is this key seat for the flywheel key will be facing directly parallel with the center line of the cylinder. It'll be facing straight up towards the cylinder head, okay, on both sides here. Okay. And so I'm right at top dead center right now, and if I rotate this forward and back, I shouldn't really see my rocker arms move a whole lot. My exhaust does a little bit, but that's because of the compression release mechanism. So I do want to make sure that I don't land or stop right on the compression release mechanism. I'm going to roll this over one full turn just so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so right now I'm now in valve overlap. Both my valves, or my rocker arms I should say, my rocker arms tight. I can't move and wiggle them at all, and my valves are actually open. And if I rotate this back and forth, you can probably see how they both move a little bit. This is the wrong place to check or set lash. We need to rotate the crankshaft 360 degrees. Move my governor out of the way because this has too much range of movement when it's not connected. So we got to be top dead center of the compression stroke, but we also have to stop before the compression release moves the exhaust. Alright, so I like to have it like that. And then our specifications is the intake valve tap clearance is supposed to be 59 10,000ths. However, I don't have a 59 10,000ths blade, but I do have a 6,000ths feeler gauge blade, which is 60 10,000ths. So I'll pull out my 6. And then the exhaust is supposed to be 78 10,000ths. Again, I don't have 78, but I do have an 80 or an 8,000ths blade for the exhaust. So I'll get out my 6 and my 8. I'm going to take my 9mm wrench and I'm going to loosen these lock nuts. These are my lock nuts that hold the adjustments in place. The screwdriver will be used to turn the screws to actually make the adjustment. So when I do this, it really would work better with an extra couple of hands, but we can make it work with 2. We just have to be very careful about how we go about doing it. First off, my feeler gauge blade has to come in from the center and go right in between the rocker arm tip and the valve stem tip. If I come in from the side, it's going to be forced to bend and rub against the outer edge of this valve cover flange, and it's going to result in bad measurements. So let's do the intake first. I'm going to take my feeler gauge blade and I'll put it here. And what I'm looking for is just a light drag. And so I'm going to loosen or tighten my screwdriver here on top of my push rod to set the appropriate clearance. So I've loosened it so it gets in there and it's loose. And so I'm going to wiggle my feeler gauge blade back and forth while I very carefully and very slowly tighten my adjuster until I just start to get a little bit of drag on my feeler gauge blade. I'm going to set this down without turning the screwdriver, and I'm going to pick up my wrench and I'm going to tighten the lock nut without letting my adjuster turn. I don't need to go full gorilla on tightening it down. I just need to snug it up. Okay, and set those down and come back with my feeler gauge blade and recheck. Okay, there should be just a slight amount of drag. I shouldn't be able to pick up on this and detect any additional clearance. Okay, I've got about a 6 1/4 here. It's kind of on the loose side of 6, but it's definitely not a 6 1/2 or a 7. Okay, so I'm going to call that good for now. And I'm going to set the exhaust the same way. Take my 8. This is my 8. I don't know, I can hardly see the markings on there. You probably can't see it on camera. And I can't even get the 8 in there, so I'm going to loosen this till I can get the 8 in there. Now that it's in there, I'm going to move my feeler gauge back and forth while I slowly tighten up my exhaust until there's just a little bit of drag. And very carefully, I need to come in without turning my screwdriver. I need to turn my nut to snug it up. I'm going to try to switch hands here. And understand that if this is the first time you're doing this, it takes practice. You may have to do it a time or two till you get it quite right. So now I've got it snug down. I'm going to recheck my 8. That's a pretty nice 8. I'm going to come back. I'm going to watch my adjuster. And then I'm just going to snug these up a little bit more to make sure that they're sufficiently snug. I don't have a torque spec for these, but they do not have to be very tight. And then I'm going to rotate my engine over 2 full turns. So that's 1, 2, to kind of like self-align everything. And then I will check. Yep, still at 6. Yep, still an 8. At this point, come find me for a checkpoint. Have your feeler gauge blades ready because I'm going to want to check it. And once I sign off on it, you're ready to install your valve cover.